Donald Trump is all business today, taking on the serious subject of how to stop terrorism. His measured tone was a marked contrast to the way the Republican presidential nominee has sounded the past couple of days when he's focused on what he sees as an enemy of his campaign, the press.
I'll tell you honestly, I'm not running against crooked Hillary Clinton. I'm running against the crooked media. That's what I'm running against. Sure. I'm not running against crooked.
Yesterday, Trump fired off a number of tweets accusing the media of not covering his rallies properly, charging he'd be up by 20 points if he got honest coverage, and describing the New York Times reporting of chaos in his campaign as, quote, fiction. At a Trump rally in Florida last Thursday, a supporter gave the press a universal sign of disgust.
I am a patriot, and you are a traitor.
So what's the strategy here for Trump? Consider that just 6% of Americans say they have a lot of confidence in the media, about the same approval rating as Congress, and maybe this approach makes some sense. Let's see what our panelists think. Joining me are Lila Alphonse, managing editor for U.S. News and World Report. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Dan Kennedy of Northeastern. Hi, Dan. And
Hi,
freelance journalist Joanna Weiss. Joanna, good to see you too. So does he have a point? Not that he'd be 20 points up, but does he not have a point that the worm has turned in terms of the press and coverage of his campaign?
I think the worm has turned, but he was pretty happy with the press back when he was using us for free publicity.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean they're not unfair now.
No, it does not mean they're not being fair now. But the thing is, they're not on his message now. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They're vetting him, and he doesn't like it.
Do you think he's got anything? I mean, I think I could safely say, 95% of the press in this country is not supporting Donald Trump when they go in the voting booth. That has to have some impact, doesn't it?
I think that's probably a fair observation. Nevertheless, the Trump campaign is a train wreck on so many levels, and we just have to expect that the media is going to cover that. This has been a tactic for Republicans going back to Spiro Agnew.
You mean attacking the press?
To attack the press, the nattering nabobs of negativism. But I'm not sure this is even a strategy. He just seems to be lashing out of anger at how badly his campaign is going.
Forget Donald Trump for a second. Jim Rudenberg in the New York Times quotes the Columbia Journalism Review, calling it a Murrow moment. He says it's not unusual to see news stories describe him being Trump as, quote, erratic without attribution to an opponent. That's a problem, is it not?
No, I don't think it is, because
Why?
he is erratic. And I mean, I think that at a certain point, the media have to be able to assert their own authority and report what they are observing in a fair and truthful manner, and not fall on the false equivalence of he said, she said.
You're nodding in agreement,
well,
yes?
No, I will say, in defense not of Donald Trump, but of the profane guy at the Trump rally, I mean, the experience of being a voter at a Trump event when you are hearing for the first time the stump speech is very different from the experience of the reporter who has probably seen 50, 70 versions at this point of the Trump speech and has moved on to the vetting process. So you can understand why voters who like him feel like maybe their perspective is not being fully heard.
Well, let's assume one of those voters is watching who I think is the most talented anchor on CNN, Anderson Cooper. Here's a fairly typical night on Cooper's show on CNN. Just watch this if you can for a second. And what I think you'll notice is a fairly typical panel. There are 8 people, which by the way is too much. But beyond that, see that guy, Jeffrey Lord, worked for the Reagan administration and obviously defends virtually every single thing that Trump says. The other 7 don't support Trump. Anderson Cooper generally is on the offensive against Trump. Dan Kennedy, that's not a problem? 8 against 1 is fair journalism?
It's not balanced, but do we want balance? I mean, I'm going to say, and I've said this on Beat the Press, we're talking about somebody who is a racist demagogue. I'm saying this on my own authority based on observation. Does that make me an unfair journalist?
No, it doesn't. And Krugman has made this, Paul Krugman in the New York Times, about this both sidesism, which is a variation of what you're saying. But even if everything you say is, would you say, racist, demagogue, and add homophobic or whatever you want, xenophobic, isn't he entitled to have somebody sitting there defending his position? The people of the Republicans and Republican voters decided he was the person to represent them in this presidential campaign. No?
Well, he's probably entitled to have somebody better than Jeffrey Lord defending him.
Well, there's Corey Lewandowski. I mean, CNN does have his
one at a
former.
time, though.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think part of that goes to the 8 people on a panel is a little bit too much, and expecting. We talked about this on the radio earlier. That expecting one guy to represent all of Trumpdom, as opposed to bringing up maybe talking a little bit more to the actual voters.
That is one network. You've got other networks where the the percentages are a bit different. One thing that really struck me is he didn't rail against the liberal media or the mainstream media. He railed against all the media. I mean, back in the 60s, ever since then, you've had the conservative media distancing themselves from the mainstream media or the liberal media, and Trump's rolled them all up in the same package. They're all corrupt. They're all rigging
First
the
of all,
election.
it's the lamestream media,
Yeah,
if you want to
sorry,
be careful.
that's right,
Sorry.
that's right.
You know, let me try one more time. I'm not doing terribly well with any of you, so let me just try it one more time. Brian Stelter, who is obviously Stelter, is that how you pronounce his name?
Stelter, yeah.
Who's the CNN media guy. This is also in the Jim Rutenberg story. This bothered me too. We'll start with you. He calls upon journalists and opinion makers to challenge Trump's, quote, dangerous claims that the electoral system is rigged against him. Failure to do so would be unpatriotic. That's not crossing the line. He essentially is a variation on you. He's a media critic. He's got a huge platform. He's calling journalists to rise up and crush this horrible message or the message that he deems to be horrible. That's not a problem?
By the way, I should point out Brian Stelter is a much nicer guy than I am.
Okay, fine. Other than that, you're in the same position.
You know, I think that Brian Stelter is actually a perfect example of what has happened in this campaign, because you were talking about somebody who is rigorously fair, knows his facts, gives people a chance to talk. And what has come down the pike in the form of Donald Trump is just so different and so threatening to what it means to this democracy that Brian Stelter can't treat him like a normal
You
candidate.
seem to agree.
Well, yeah, a big frustration for journalists covering this campaign is they do the fact-checking that is their job to do. I mean, people are watchdogging this campaign as they do for all presidential campaigns. He'll say a falsehood, Donald Trump. The media will report it. He'll continue to say it. He'll double down on it. I mean, the usual fact-checking isn't working.
Wait. But Hillary Clinton has said repeatedly, and that is, quote, untrue, to use the CNN thing, that James Comey is saying, head of the FBI, has said that what she said was true and accurate.
And she gets
In
called
fact,
that
we all
too.
know it's not. So just like they use the noun erratic, the adjective erratic, which Dan seems to think it's okay because he is erratic. Well, she is lying about what Comey said. Should we use an adjective like that?
I'll bet you found some people on Fox News who have called her erratic.
I'm not talking about opinion people.
Yeah.
I'm talking about straight journalists.
She was hammered for that at the NABJ, NAHJ meeting in Washington just less than 2 weeks ago. It was not a press conference. It was a presentation to the press, but it was
4 questions.
Yep, there were 4 questions, and they started right off the bat by hammering her on that. And if it's possible to use hammering in the positive, I mean that in the positive. They held her accountable for that statement. So I don't think it's fair to say that people are ignoring her spin and accepting or challenging his spin. I think that depending on where you get your news, you're going to see more of one or more of the other.
I'm not saying they ignore it. I'm just saying if an adjective is appropriate, because that's what it is, to quote Dan Kennedy a minute ago, then an adjective might be appropriate to describe Hillary Clinton's lack of being genuine vis-a-vis
Politically?
this.
This is
Talking about
just
different
not a
volume.
normal race. If Hillary Clinton had to run against a normal Republican, God help her, if she had to run against John Kasich or Jeb Bush, she'd be getting hammered all the time.
You know the great Trevor Noah line that I've only quoted 10,000 times? This is the 2 luckiest people on the planet.
Yeah.
They're running against the only person they could ever possibly beat in a presidential election. Can we step back for a second? The Shorenstein Center put something out the other day, which I think is nothing shocking to anybody. 11% of campaign coverage through primary season was on the issues, more than half on the competitive game. And even when it was on the issues, they quoted the Washington Post thing, Trump is a legit candidate. These new polls prove it, meaning using an issue to segue. That is the major failing of, I mean, by the way, we're guilty here as well, I should say.
I'm curious how those numbers differ this year from previous years,
don't know if
because
they
that
do
is
at all.
always the critique of campaign coverage, that it is focused on the horse race and the money and the
There's a huge
back and
difference
forth.
this year. You're focused on the horse race, you're focused on the drama. This year you've got a candidate who helped make that an industry. You've got a reality TV guy who knows how to work the media, who is now railing against the media that helped make him popular.
But that's not an excuse for us, is it?
No, of course not.
It's no excuse whatsoever. And in fact, the one time that the media especially owes it to democracy to focus on the issues is during the primary seasons, because at least during the general, you generally know what a Democrat and a Republican stand for. But during the primaries, that's when you need to explain to people who these folks are. And instead, the entire primary season, especially on the Republican side, played out as a reality show, and it didn't serve anybody's interest.
It's definitely not an excuse for the media, but it does show a little bit of why this campaign seems tailor-made for that kind of drama.
I'm so glad I'm not throwing to a pole now and being humiliated myself. Lila, it's good to see you.
Nice to see you,
Dan,
too.
pleasure.
Jim, thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks all three.